Samuel Whitmore never planned to become a hermit. 3 years ago, he was just another family man heading west with dreams of fertile land and a fresh start. He had a loving wife, 2 young children, and enough hope to fill a covered wagon. But cholera doesn't care about dreams or plans. It swept through their wagon train like wildfire, taking his entire family in just 4 terrible days, while other survivors pushed on toward California. Samuel couldn't bring himself to continue. What was the point? The land he dreamed of farming would just remind him of the family who would never see it. So when the wagon train reached the rolling hills of central Texas, he quietly slipped away one morning before dawn, taking only his horse, his rifle, and the few tools he could carry. He found a spot that felt right, a small valley tucked between 2 cedar-covered ridges, with a clear stream running through it and plenty of game nearby. It was isolated enough that he might never see another white face, which suited him just fine. He spent his first month there building a simple log cabin, nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a roof to keep the rain out. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to dark places. The cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. One room, maybe 12 feet square, with a stone fireplace he'd built himself using rocks from the stream. He chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and moss and covered the roof with cedar shakes he'd split by hand. Inside it was sparse, but functional: a rough wooden table, a single chair, a bed built into one corner, and shelves along the walls for his few possessions. A person could live comfortably here, if comfort meant having what you needed and nothing more. Samuel fell into a routine that rarely varied. He woke with the sun, checked his rabbit snares, and tended to his small vegetable garden behind the cabin. He planted beans, corn, and squash, crops he'd learned would grow well together from an old farmer back in Missouri. Most days he'd spend hours hunting or fishing, not just for food, but because the activity kept his mind occupied. He became skilled at reading animal tracks and understanding the rhythms of the forest. The loneliness was hardest in the evenings. That's when memories would creep in: his wife's laugh, his daughter's questions about everything she saw, his son's excited chatter about the adventures waiting ahead. Samuel learned to fight these moments by keeping his hands busy. He carved wooden bowls and spoons, mended his clothes, and maintained his equipment. Sometimes he'd sit on his porch and play his harmonica, the melancholy notes echoing off the hills. He wasn't completely isolated from human contact. Maybe once every few months, he'd make the 2-day ride to the nearest trading post to exchange furs for supplies he couldn't make himself: salt, coffee, ammunition, and the occasional newspaper that was always months old by the time it reached the frontier. The trader, old Pete Henderson, would try to engage him in conversation, but Samuel never stayed longer than necessary. He wasn't rude, just distant, like a man who'd forgotten how to be social. What surprised Samuel was how quickly he adapted to solitude. The first few months had been difficult, with his mind constantly expecting to hear familiar voices or see familiar faces. But gradually he became attuned to different sounds: the warning call of a jay, the rustle of deer moving through brush, the distant howl of wolves. The forest became his companion, predictable in its rhythms and honest in its dangers. The Comanche knew about him, of course. You couldn't live in their territory without them knowing. Samuel had spotted warriors watching him from distant ridges during his first year, but they never approached. He'd heard stories about Comanche raids from other settlers, tales that would make a person's blood run cold. But his experience was different. Maybe they saw him as harmless, one man alone, posing no threat to their hunting grounds or their people. Samuel made a conscious decision to show respect for his neighbors, even if they remained invisible most of the time. There was a natural spring about a quarter-mile from his cabin, a beautiful spot where clear water bubbled up from limestone rocks. He'd noticed that the Comanche had used this place for generations. There were worn paths leading to it and signs that ceremonies had been held there. So Samuel made it a habit to leave small gifts at the spring. Nothing valuable, just tokens of respect, a pouch of tobacco, a steel knife he'd forged himself, sometimes jerky from his hunting. He taught himself basic Comanche words by listening carefully during the few times he'd encountered hunting parties at a distance. They would observe each other across valleys or meadows, maintaining respectful space. Samuel would raise his hand in greeting and sometimes receive a nod in return. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was understanding. He lived quietly, disturbed. Nothing sacred, and took only what he needed from the land. His appearance changed over those 3 years. His hair grew long, and he kept a full beard that he trimmed with his hunting knife. His clothes became patched and weathered, taking on the earth tones of his environment. His hands grew calloused from constant work, and his body lean from the physical demands of frontier life. When he caught his reflection in the stream, he sometimes didn't recognize the man looking back at him. The seasons became his calendar. Spring meant planting and the return of migratory birds. Summer brought long days of hunting and preserving meat for winter. Fall was harvest time, not just for his small garden, but for gathering wild nuts, berries, and roots. Winter meant long evenings by the fire, mending equipment and planning for the year ahead. Each season brought its own challenges and rewards, its own rhythm that Samuel learned to appreciate. He developed skills he never knew he possessed. He learned to tan hides properly, to forge simple tools from scrap metal, to predict weather patterns by watching clouds and feeling changes in air pressure. He became an expert tracker and hunter, able to move through the forest as quietly as the animals he pursued. These weren't hobbies anymore. They were survival skills that kept him alive, but perhaps the most significant change was internal. The sharp edge of his grief slowly dulled, not disappearing but becoming something he could carry without it cutting him constantly. He still missed his family terribly, still talked to them sometimes when he was alone, but the pain no longer threatened to overwhelm him. The solitude that had initially been an escape became a kind of healing. Samuel's reputation among the scattered frontier community grew quietly over time. Travelers occasionally got lost and stumbled upon his cabin, and he always helped them find their way, shared his food, and offered shelter for the night. He never asked for payment, never preached, never pried into their business. Some were deserters from the army, others were men running from past mistakes. Samuel treated them all the same, with basic human kindness and the understanding that everyone carried burdens. As his third winter in the valley drew to a close, Samuel had achieved something he never expected, a kind of peace. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance. He'd found a way to live with his loss, to honor his family's memory while building a new kind of existence. He thought this was how his story would end, a quiet man living quietly in a beautiful, lonely place. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered by 7 desperate young women, who would transform his hermit's existence into something entirely different. The morning that would change everything was still weeks away, but the stage was set. Samuel Whitmore, the reluctant hermit of Cedar Ridge, had unknowingly prepared himself for the greatest challenge of his life. Samuel woke that November morning to the sound he'd grown to love most, absolute silence. The kind of quiet that only exists in deep wilderness, broken only by the gentle crackling of dying embers in his fireplace. Frost had painted intricate patterns on his single window, and his breath came out in small clouds as he swung his legs out of bed. It was going to be a cold day, the kind where smart animals stayed in their dens and smart men stayed close to their fires. He pulled on his worn leather boots and stepped outside to check his rabbit snares, following a routine he'd perfected over 3 years. The world was painted white with frost, each blade of grass standing like a tiny crystal soldier in the morning light. His footsteps crunched softly on the frozen ground as he made his way along the familiar path through the cedars. The first snare was empty, which wasn't unusual. The second held a fat cottontail that would make a fine stew. Samuel was checking the third trap when he heard it, a sound so unexpected that he froze in place, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. It sounded like voices, human voices, calling out in distress, but that was impossible. No one came to his valley, especially not in weather like this. He stood perfectly still, holding his breath and listening hard. There it was again, definitely voices, and they were getting closer. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the knife on his belt. In 3 years of solitude, unexpected visitors had never brought good news. They were usually men running from something, and sometimes that something followed them. The voices grew louder, more urgent, and Samuel could tell they weren't speaking English. The rhythm and tone sounded like Comanche, but there was something different about it, higher pitched, more desperate than the controlled speech of the warriors he'd occasionally encountered. He made his way back toward his cabin, moving carefully through the trees, trying to get a look at whoever was approaching his home. What he saw when he reached the edge of his clearing made him stop dead in his tracks. 7 figures were stumbling toward his cabin, and they weren't warriors. They were young women, girls really, and they looked like they'd been through hell. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their hair tangled with bits of brush and leaves. Even from a distance, Samuel could see they were exhausted, barely staying on their feet. The youngest one, who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, was being supported by 2 of the others. She was clearly sick, her head lolling to one side as they half-carried, half-dragged her through the frost-covered grass. The oldest of the group, maybe 16, was in the lead, looking around frantically as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. Samuel's mind raced. These were Comanche girls, that much was obvious from their clothing and appearance. But what were they doing here, alone, in this condition? Where were their families, their protectors? In all his time on the frontier, he'd never heard of Comanche women traveling without male escorts, especially not young ones like these. The girls reached his cabin door and began pounding on it desperately. Even though Samuel was still 50 yards away in the tree line, he could hear the fear in their voices as they called out. They were saying something over and over, the same words repeated with increasing urgency. He recognized one word, help, spoken in broken English. For a moment, Samuel hesitated. Every instinct told him that getting involved with these girls would bring nothing but trouble. If they were running from something, that something might come looking for them. If they were lost from their tribe, their families would eventually track them down. Either way, helping them would end his peaceful existence and possibly put his life in danger. But then he saw the youngest girl collapse. She simply crumpled to the ground in front of his door while the others tried desperately to lift her back up. She was burning with fever. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the flush in her cheeks and the way she shivered uncontrollably. This wasn't just about being lost or frightened anymore. This child was seriously ill, and without help, she might not survive another night in the cold. Samuel's hesitation vanished. He'd lost his own children to disease, and he couldn't stand by and watch another child suffer when he had the means. To help, he walked quickly across the clearing, making enough noise so the girls would hear him coming and not be startled by his sudden appearance. The effect of his emergence from the woods was immediate. The 6 girls who were still standing spun around to face him, their eyes wide with terror. They pressed themselves against his cabin door as if trying to disappear through the wood. The oldest one stepped protectively in front of the others, spreading her arms wide despite her obvious exhaustion. Samuel stopped about 10 feet away and slowly raised both hands to show he meant no harm. He'd learned this gesture from his occasional encounters with Comanche hunting parties, and he hoped it would have the same calming effect now. The girls watched him warily, ready to run despite their exhaustion. "It's okay," Samuel said softly, using the gentle tone he'd once used with frightened animals. "I won't hurt you." He knew they probably didn't understand his words, but tone was universal. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly, then pointed to his cabin and made welcoming gestures. The oldest girl said something rapid in Comanche to the others, then looked back at Samuel. She pointed to the sick child on the ground and said something that sounded like a question. Her meaning was clear even without translation. She was asking for help. Samuel nodded and moved slowly toward the collapsed girl. The others tensed but didn't back away. Up close, he could see just how bad their condition really was. Their clothes were torn from running through brush, their hands and arms scratched and bleeding. They had the hollow-eyed look of people who hadn't eaten properly in days, and the sick child was burning with fever. He knelt beside the youngest girl and gently felt her forehead. She was dangerously hot, her breathing shallow and rapid. Without immediate care, she wouldn't last long. Samuel looked up at the others and made carrying motions, pointing toward his cabin door. After a moment of hesitation, the oldest girl nodded. Samuel carefully lifted the sick child. She weighed almost nothing and carried her to his door. The others followed closely, still ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He pushed open his cabin door and gestured for them to enter. The warmth hit them immediately, and Samuel saw several of the girls visibly relax as the heat from his fireplace reached them. He laid the sick child on his bed and quickly built up the fire, adding wood until the flames roared and the small cabin filled with blessed warmth. The girls huddled together near the fireplace. Speaking in low, urgent whispers, Samuel could see them stealing glances at him, trying to figure out if he was friend or foe. He moved slowly and deliberately, showing them his actions before he made them. When he reached for his water bucket, he held it up so they could see what he was doing before approaching the bed. He spent the next hour caring for the sick child, bathing her fevered face with cool water and trying to get small amounts of liquid down her throat. The other girls watched his every move, gradually relaxing as they realized he was genuinely trying to help their friend. As the cabin warmed up and the immediate crisis passed, Samuel began to piece together their story through gestures and the few English words the oldest girl knew. They had been running for days, fleeing from something that terrified them. They were hungry, exhausted, and desperately afraid. The sick child had collapsed just as they'd seen the smoke from his chimney and followed it to his cabin. Samuel prepared a simple meal of cornbread and rabbit stew, watching as the hungry girls devoured every bite. He gave them clean water and found extra blankets to wrap around their shoulders. Gradually, their story began to emerge through broken English sign language and desperate gestures. They had been captured during a raid by a rival band, taken as prizes from their families. For weeks, they had been held by warriors who treated them harshly, planning to trade them or keep them as servants. But 3 nights ago, when their captors had gotten drunk on stolen whiskey, the girls had managed to escape into the darkness. Since then, they had been running blindly through unfamiliar territory, following streams and avoiding open ground, trying to get as far away as possible from their captors. They had no food, no weapons, and no idea where they were going. The youngest had fallen ill on the 2nd day, but they couldn't stop to care for her properly. They were driven by pure terror and the knowledge that if they were recaptured, their punishment would be severe. As night fell, and the girls finally settled into exhausted sleep around his fireplace, Samuel sat in his chair and stared into the flames. His quiet, solitary life had just become infinitely more complicated. These girls were someone's daughters, someone's sisters. Their families would be looking for them, and so would their captors. Both groups would eventually track them to his cabin. He looked at the 7 sleeping faces, so young and vulnerable in the firelight, and knew he'd made a choice that would change everything. There was no going back to his peaceful existence now. Whatever came next, he was committed to protecting these children who had stumbled into his isolated world seeking refuge. Samuel barely slept that first night. He sat in his wooden chair by the window, rifle across his knees, listening to every sound the darkness brought. The 7 girls lay curled around his fireplace like exhausted puppies, finally getting the rest their bodies desperately needed. But Samuel knew that rest might be short-lived. In his 3 years of frontier life, he'd learned that trouble rarely traveled alone. The youngest girl's fever broke just before dawn, and Samuel felt a wave of relief wash over him. She was still weak, but her breathing had steadied, and the dangerous flush had left her cheeks. When she opened her eyes and managed a small smile, even the other girls seemed to relax for the first time since their arrival, but Samuel's relief was tempered by a growing unease. As the morning light filtered through his cabin window, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were no birds singing. In 3 years, he'd never experienced a morning without the cheerful chatter of jays and the melodic calls of mockingbirds. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. He stepped outside to check his surroundings. moving carefully and staying close to the cabin walls. The frost from the previous morning had melted, leaving the ground soft and muddy, perfect for tracking. Samuel's heart sank as he studied the area around his cabin. The girls' desperate flight had left clear signs everywhere: broken branches, trampled grass, and most damning of all, footprints leading directly to his door. A blind man could follow this trail, and Samuel knew that whoever was hunting these girls was far from blind. He'd heard stories about Comanche trackers who could follow a trail days old across solid rock. These signs might as well have been painted arrows pointing straight to his cabin. Inside, the oldest girl seemed to sense his worry. She approached him cautiously and pointed toward the window, then made sweeping gestures with her arms. Through broken English and hand signs, she managed to communicate something that chilled Samuel to the bone. Many warriors were coming. Many, many warriors. Samuel had hoped they might have a few days, maybe even a week, before anyone tracked the girls to his valley. But as he studied the girls' frightened expression and urgent gestures, he realized their pursuers were much closer than he dared imagine. The silence of the forest wasn't just unusual. It was a warning. He spent the morning trying to prepare for whatever was coming, though he knew his options were limited. His cabin was sturdy, but not built to withstand a siege. He had perhaps 50 rounds of ammunition, enough food for a few days, and a water source that required leaving the safety of his walls. Against a determined group of warriors, these advantages meant very little. The girls watched his preparations with growing anxiety. They understood, even without words, that their arrival had put their protector in terrible danger. The oldest girl kept trying to communicate something to Samuel, pointing to herself and the others, then toward the door. She was offering to leave, to draw the danger away from him. But Samuel shook his head firmly. He'd made his choice when he brought them inside, and he wouldn't abandon them now. By midday, the signs were unmistakable. Samuel caught glimpses of movement on the distant ridges, dark figures that appeared for a moment and then vanished, always just at the edge of vision. They were being watched, studied, surrounded with the patient precision of skilled hunters, who knew their prey had nowhere to run. The girls huddled together near the fireplace, speaking in whispers and occasionally pointing toward the windows. Samuel didn't need to understand their language to know what they were discussing. They were sharing what they knew about their captors, trying to prepare him for what was coming. Their expressions told him everything he needed to know. These weren't ordinary raiders or opportunistic bandits. These were serious men with serious grievances. As afternoon wore on, the watchers grew bolder. Samuel spotted riders moving openly across distant meadows, no longer bothering to hide their presence. They wanted him to see them, wanted him to understand that escape was impossible. It was a psychological tactic as old as warfare itself. Let your enemy know he's trapped, and watch fear do half your work for you. But Samuel noticed something else that gave him a glimmer of hope. The riders weren't all from the same group. He could tell by their different styles of dress and the way they maintained separate clusters even while moving together. This wasn't just one band of warriors, it was multiple groups, and that suggested something more complicated than a simple rescue mission. The youngest girl, much improved since her fever broke, approached Samuel with something in her hands. It was a small piece of beadwork, probably torn from her dress during their escape. She pressed it into his palm and spoke a single word in heavily accented English. "Father." Then she pointed to herself and the other girls, repeating the word. Samuel understood. These weren't just random captives. They were the daughters of someone important, someone whose loss would demand blood payment. As the sun began to set, Samuel made a discovery that changed everything. While checking his water barrel, he found a single eagle feather stuck in the wooden slats. It hadn't been there that morning, and there was no way it could have gotten there naturally. Someone had placed it there deliberately, and Samuel knew enough about Comanche customs to understand its meaning. It was a message, a sign of respect from one warrior to another, acknowledging his courage in protecting the girls. That night, the watchers made their presence known in a way that took Samuel's breath away. As darkness fell, small fires began appearing on every ridge and hilltop surrounding his valley. One by one, they flickered to life until his cabin sat in the center of a vast circle of flame. Samuel counted them carefully, more than 30 separate fires, which meant far more warriors than he'd imagined possible. The girls pressed against the windows, pointing at different fires and speaking in urgent whispers. Samuel realized they were identifying their captors among the groups, separating friend from foe in the gathering army. Some of those fires represented rescue, others revenge. His cabin had become the unlikely center of what might be a major confrontation between rival bands. Sleep was impossible that second night. Samuel maintained his vigil by the window while the girls took turns watching from the other openings in his cabin. The fires burned steadily through the darkness, a constant reminder that hundreds of eyes were watching their every move. Occasionally, Samuel could hear distant sounds, horses moving, men calling to each other across the darkness, the kind of controlled activity that suggested military-style organization. Just before dawn, something changed. The fires began to move, flowing down from the ridges like slow rivers of light. Samuel watched in fascination and terror as the scattered groups consolidated into larger formations, positioning themselves in a tightening circle around his valley. They were no longer content to simply watch and wait. As the first light of morning revealed the full scope of their situation, Samuel felt his heart sink into his boots. The valley that had been his peaceful refuge for 3 years was now filled with mounted warriors. Hundreds of them, spread out in organized formations that spoke of careful planning and unified command. War paint gleamed on bronzed faces, feathers fluttered from lances, and the morning sun reflected off polished weapons. The oldest girl joined him at the window and gasped at what she saw. Even she hadn't expected a gathering of this magnitude. She spoke rapidly to the others, and Samuel heard fear creep into voices that had remained steady through days of desperate flight. This wasn't just about 7 escaped captives anymore. This had become something much larger, much more dangerous. Samuel checked his rifle one more time and made sure his powder was dry. He had no illusions about his chances in a direct fight, but he was determined to protect his unexpected charges as long as possible. The girls had trusted him with their lives, and he wouldn't betray that trust, no matter what the morning might bring. As the sun climbed higher, revealing more details of the massive gathering outside his cabin, Samuel realized that his quiet life as a hermit was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. The next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of 7 young women who had stumbled into his isolated world seeking refuge. The storm that had been gathering around his valley was about to break, and Samuel Whitmore, the reluctant hermit of Cedar Ridge, stood directly in its path. The morning Samuel had been dreading finally arrived with a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath his cabin. He woke not to silence, but to the sound of hundreds of horses moving as one, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm like distant thunder that seemed to come from every direction at once. Through his small window, he could see his worst fears had become reality overnight. His peaceful valley had been transformed into something that looked like a scene from his nightmares. Nearly 700 Comanche warriors had materialized during the night, forming perfect military formations that stretched as far as he could see. They sat motionless on their painted horses, creating a human wall that completely surrounded his tiny cabin. The morning mist swirled around them, making the entire scene look otherworldly, like something from a fever dream. Samuel's hands shook as he gripped his rifle, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer overwhelming nature of what he was facing. In 3 years of frontier life, he'd never seen anything like this. Individual warriors, yes. Small hunting parties, certainly. But this was an army, organized and disciplined in a way that spoke of careful planning and unified purpose. The girls had awakened to the sound as well, and they pressed against every window in the cabin, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and recognition. They were pointing at different groups, speaking rapidly in whispers, and Samuel could tell they were identifying faces among the hundreds of warriors. Some brought hope of rescue, others promised terrible revenge. The oldest girl came to stand beside him at the main window. Her young face was drawn with worry, but there was also determination there. She pointed to a group of warriors on the eastern ridge, their horses decorated with distinctive white and blue paint. "Oh, Father," she whispered, using one of the few English words she knew. These were her people, her family's warriors, come to bring her home, but then she pointed to another group, their faces painted for war, their lances decorated with scalps and feathers. Her expression changed to one of pure fear as she spoke, a name that sounded like a curse. These were the men who had captured her and her companions, the ones they had fled from in desperate terror. Samuel didn't need translation to understand that these warriors had not come to negotiate. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, the full scope of the gathering became clear. This wasn't just about 7 escaped girls anymore. Samuel was looking at what might be the largest gathering of Comanche warriors in decades, drawn together by circumstances that had spiraled far beyond a simple rescue mission. His cabin had become the unlikely center of a confrontation that could affect the balance of power between multiple tribes. The warriors began their war circles then, a display that took Samuel's breath away despite his terror. Hundreds of riders moved in perfect synchronization, their horses dancing and prancing as they rode in great spiraling patterns around his cabin. War paint gleamed in the morning sun, feathers fluttered from lances and headdresses, and the thunder of hoofbeats created a rhythm that seemed to shake the very earth. But Samuel noticed something that gave him a sliver of hope. The different groups maintained their separate formations even during the display. They were cooperating, yes, but they weren't united. This was an alliance of convenience, not a single force with a single purpose. That division might be the only thing keeping him alive. The war circles continued for what felt like hours, each group trying to outdo the others in their display of strength and skill. Samuel watched in fascination despite his fear as warriors performed incredible feats of horsemanship, hanging from their mounts' sides while firing arrows or brandishing weapons. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a demonstration of power. Unlike anything he'd ever witnessed, finally, the displays ended and an expectant silence fell over the valley. Samuel could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching his cabin, waiting for his response to their show of force. He knew this was a crucial moment, that his next actions would determine whether this confrontation ended in negotiation or bloodshed. A single rider separated himself from the largest group and approached the cabin under a white buffalo hide held high on a lance. Samuel recognized the significance immediately. This was a request for parley, a chance to talk before violence began. The rider stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the valley. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. The warrior was requesting a meeting, a formal negotiation to resolve the situation. Samuel looked around his cabin at the 7 frightened faces watching him. Knowing that his decision in the next few moments would determine all their fates, he checked his rifle one more time, said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and opened his cabin door. The sight that greeted him nearly made him step back inside. From ground level, the circle of warriors looked even more massive, an unbroken wall of painted faces and gleaming weapons that stretched to every horizon. He felt like an ant who had wandered into a gathering of eagles. Samuel walked slowly toward the messenger, his hands visible and empty except for his rifle, which he carried loosely at his side. The warrior was older than he'd expected, with gray streaks in his long black hair and the weathered face of a man who had seen many battles. His horse was painted with symbols that Samuel didn't recognize, but their meaning was clear. This was a man of importance, probably a war chief or senior leader. The chief spoke again, this time mixing Comanche words with broken English. Samuel caught fragments, girls, blood, honor, words that painted a picture of the complex situation he'd stumbled into. Through gestures and the few words they shared, Samuel began to understand the full scope of what was happening. The girls weren't just random captives. They were the daughters and sisters of Chief Running Bear, a powerful leader whose band controlled hunting grounds stretching for hundreds of miles. Their capture had been an act of war, an insult that demanded blood payment according to ancient law. But their escape had complicated everything, because now multiple tribes were involved, each with their own claims and grievances. The chief who had taken them as captives was present too, along with his warriors. He claimed ownership by right of conquest, supported by treaties and traditions that went back generations. But Running Bear's people claimed blood right, the sacred obligation to protect family members regardless of circumstances. Samuel's cabin had become the unlikely battlefield where these competing claims would be resolved. As the negotiation continued, more chiefs joined the discussion. Samuel found himself at the center of a diplomatic gathering unlike anything in frontier history. Each leader brought their own warriors, their own interpreters, their own understanding of law and custom. The conversation switched between multiple languages, with hand signs filling the gaps where words failed. Samuel realized that his years of respectful behavior toward the Comanche people had earned him something precious, the right to be heard. The tobacco and small gifts he'd left at the sacred spring, his careful avoidance of hunting grounds and ceremonial sites, his quiet acknowledgement of their presence and authority had all contributed to this moment. They saw him not as an enemy, but as someone who understood respect and honor. Hours passed as the negotiation continued. The sun climbed high overhead, baking the valley in autumn heat, while hundreds of warriors waited patiently for their leaders to reach a decision. Samuel's legs ached from standing. His throat was dry from the constant translation efforts. But he didn't dare show any sign of weakness or impatience. The girls remained in his cabin, watching through windows as their fate was decided by men speaking languages and invoking laws they only partially understood. Samuel could see their faces pressed against the glass, hope and fear warring in their young expressions as the discussion continued. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Samuel sensed a change in the tone of the negotiations. The chiefs were no longer arguing positions but exploring possibilities. Someone had suggested something new, something that hadn't been considered before. The conversation became more animated, with chiefs conferring among themselves and sending messengers back to their warriors. Samuel didn't understand the details, but he could feel the shift in mood around the valley. This wasn't going to end in the bloodbath he'd feared. Something else was happening, something unprecedented that would change everything for him and the 7 girls who had sought refuge in his isolated cabin. The sun was beginning to set when the chiefs finally reached their decision. Samuel watched as they formed a formal circle, each leader taking his place according to complex protocols he didn't understand but recognized as deeply significant. The moment of truth had arrived, and Samuel Whitmore, the hermit who had never wanted anything more than to be left alone, found himself at the center of a decision that would become legend among the Comanche people for generations to come. The circle of chiefs had formed, and Samuel found himself standing in the center of something that felt bigger than himself, bigger than the 7 frightened girls in his cabin, maybe even bigger than the hundreds of warriors watching from the surrounding hills. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath as the most powerful Comanche leaders prepared to deliver their judgment. Chief Running Bear, the father of 4 of the girls, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of generations, invoking laws and customs that went back to the beginning of his people's memory. Through the halting translation of a young warrior who spoke broken English, Samuel understood the heart of his argument. These were his daughters, his blood, stolen from their families in an act of war. No negotiation could change that fundamental truth. They belonged with their people, and he had come to take them home. But then the war chief who had originally captured the girls stepped forward, his painted face grim with determination. His argument was equally compelling in its simplicity. He had taken the girls in honorable combat, following the same laws of war that Running Bear himself had used countless times. They were his by right of conquest, valuable prizes that he would not surrender without payment of blood or treasure. Samuel listened to both arguments, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Each chief was right according to his own understanding of justice. Each had valid claims supported by traditions that went back centuries. And yet, their competing truths had created a situation where no solution seemed possible without violence. As the debate continued, Samuel noticed something that gave him hope. The chiefs weren't just arguing their positions, they were genuinely trying to find a solution that would preserve honor for everyone involved. These weren't bloodthirsty savages, as he'd heard them described in frontier towns. These were thoughtful leaders wrestling with complex questions of law, tradition, and justice. Hours passed as the negotiation continued. The sun sank lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and red that reminded Samuel of the autumn evenings he'd once shared with his own family around their fireplace back in Missouri. The memory gave him strength, reminding him that he too had once been a father, that he understood the desperate love that drove Running Bear to risk everything for his daughters. Finally, as shadows grew long and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, one of the elder chiefs raised his hand for silence. This was a man whose authority was acknowledged by everyone present, whose words carried weight that transcended tribal boundaries. When he spoke, even the horses seemed to stand straighter, sensing the importance of the moment. The old chief's words were translated carefully, with frequent pauses to ensure accuracy. He spoke of Samuel's 3 years of respectful behavior, of the gifts left at the sacred spring, of the quiet way he had lived among them without disturbing their hunting grounds or sacred places. He acknowledged that Samuel had shown honor by protecting the girls when they sought refuge, even knowing the danger it would bring upon himself. Then the old chief proposed something that stunned everyone present. He suggested that Samuel be given the right to adopt all 7 girls as his daughters according to Comanche law. This would make them members of his clan, placing them under his protection and giving him the authority to make decisions about their fate. It was unprecedented, but not impossible under their ancient customs. The suggestion created an immediate stir among the assembled chiefs. Samuel could see them conferring in urgent whispers, weighing the implications of such an extraordinary proposal. Some seemed intrigued by the creative solution, while others appeared skeptical about breaking with tradition so dramatically. Samuel's own mind was reeling. Adoption into a Comanche clan was not something taken lightly. It would mean permanent responsibility for 7 young women, permanent ties to a people he barely understood, and an end to the solitary life he had built for himself. But as he looked toward his cabin, where 7 frightened faces pressed against the windows, he knew he couldn't abandon them now. Running Bear was the first to respond to the proposal. Through his translator, he made it clear that while he respected Samuel's courage and kindness, his daughters belonged with their own people. They had families who loved them, traditions they needed to learn, and a culture that was their birthright. No adoption ceremony, however well-intentioned, could change that fundamental truth. The war chief who had captured the girls was equally firm in his opposition, though for different reasons. He had risked the lives of his warriors to take these prizes, and he would not see them given away to someone who had no claim on them by blood or conquest. His honor demanded either their return or payment in equivalent value. As the debate continued, Samuel realized that the proposed adoption was not meant to be the final solution, but rather a bridge to something more complex. The old chief was not trying to take the girls away from their families or their captors, but to create a new framework within which all competing claims could be resolved. The breakthrough came when the youngest of the girls, the one whose fever Samuel had broken, on that first desperate night appeared in his cabin doorway. She had been listening to the entire negotiation from inside, and now she walked slowly toward the circle of chiefs with a determination that surprised everyone present. She spoke in clear Comanche, her child's voice carrying across the silent valley with remarkable authority. Samuel couldn't understand her words, but he could see their effect on the assembled leaders. Some nodded approvingly, others looked surprised, and Running Bear's stern expression softened as he listened to his youngest daughter speak. The translation, when it came, revealed the wisdom of a child who had seen too much suffering. She told the chiefs that Samuel had saved her life when she was dying of fever, that he had risked everything to protect all 7 of them when he could have turned them away. She said that while she loved her father and wanted to return to her people, She also wanted Samuel to be acknowledged as her protector and friend. Her words sparked something new in the negotiation. Other girls began to emerge from the cabin, each adding their voice to the discussion. They spoke of Samuel's kindness, of his gentle care during their recovery, of the safety they had found in his humble home. They weren't asking to be taken away from their families, but they were insisting that Samuel be honored for his role in their rescue. The solution, when it finally emerged, was more elegant than anything Samuel could have imagined. The chiefs agreed to a modified adoption ceremony that would make Samuel an honorary brother to Running Bear and the other fathers, rather than a replacement for them. The girls would return to their families, but Samuel would be acknowledged as their protector and given the right to visit them and participate in important decisions about their futures. For the war chief who had originally captured them, a different form of compensation was arranged. Samuel's years of successful trapping and hunting had accumulated a considerable store of furs and trade goods. These, combined with contributions from Running Bear's band, would be given as payment for the girl's freedom. Honor would be satisfied without bloodshed. As the formal ceremonies began under the light of a full moon, Samuel felt a profound sense of completion. He had come to this valley as a broken man seeking solitude, thinking his days of caring for others were over. But life had brought him 7 daughters he had never expected, hundreds of brothers he had never imagined, and a purpose he had thought was lost forever. The adoption ceremony itself was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. He was painted with sacred symbols, given a new name that honored his courage, and formally welcomed into the extended family of the Comanche nation. The girls who had sought refuge in his cabin became his daughters not through blood but through bonds of protection and mutual respect that ran even deeper. As dawn broke over the valley the next morning, the great gathering began to disperse. Warriors who had faced each other in potential battle now rode away as allies, their honor intact and their grievances resolved through wisdom rather than warfare. The girls prepared to return to their families, but they were no longer the same. Frightened children who had stumbled to Samuel's door just days before, Samuel stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching his newfound family prepare for departure. His years of solitude were over, but they had been replaced by something far richer. He was no longer a hermit hiding from the world, but a bridge between two peoples, a father to 7 daughters, and a living example of how courage and compassion could triumph over fear and hatred. The valley that had once echoed only with the sound of Samuel's footsteps now rang with laughter and conversation, as his extended family made plans for future visits and continuing relationships. His simple cabin had become the center of something larger than he had ever imagined possible, a place where different worlds had met and found common ground in the simple act of protecting those who needed help. Samuel Whitmore had sought peace in isolation, but he had found something far more valuable in connection. His story had begun with loss and loneliness, but it ended with love, family, and the profound